Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about UFO sightings and alien encounters in Florida. With stories coming from UFOs over Florida, Humanoid and Other Strange Encounters in the Sunshine State by Albert S. Rosales. The James Flynn Encounter, Cypress Preserve near Fort Myers, Florida, March 15, 1965, 1 a.m. Experienced woodsman James Flynn spotted something unusual that he judged to be slightly 1 mile away. Whatever it was hovering, shaped like a broad, upside-down cone, an estimated 200 meters in the air above some cypress trees. After a while, it began flying off toward the northeast. After 2 to 3 minutes, it returned to the same place and hovered again, this time for an estimated 5 minutes. Then it took off toward the southwest at a high rate of speed. Soon, however, it returned to the same location again. At this point, Flynn was only about a quarter mile away, and the object seemed to come down among some trees in a small knoll. Suspecting he was watching some type of secret aircraft from Cape Canaveral, Flynn approached it. Flynn described the object as some 25 feet high and twice that in its diameter. Up near the top were 4 by 2 square foot window-looking sections that emitted a yellowish glow. The thing was metallic and seemed to be made of 4 by 4 plates that appeared to be held together by rivets. Around the base of the object was an orange-red illumination that seemed to cast a glow on the ground some 75 feet around its rim. After some 40 minutes into the sighting, Flynn decided to approach closer. He reasoned the crew of the experimental craft might need some assistance. He noticed a deafening ringing noise he compared to a high-powered transformer. The dog in the cage is howling and trying to frantically get out. Some 200 yards away, Flynn stops his buggy and waves his arms in the air. He can see the object is hovering a mere 4 feet over the grass. A blast of wind nearly knocks him off his feet. He approached closer, within an estimated and mere 75 feet from the craft. He again waves his arms. Then, from under one of the apparent windows, a beam of light, like a welder's torch, suddenly appears and strikes him on the forehead. He stated later that it felt like he'd been struck with a sledgehammer. He soon blacked out. Sometime later, he regained consciousness, finding himself initially blind. He lay there for a long while until he recovered a small amount of vision in his left eye. It was already Tuesday morning, and Flynn gathered up his dogs and made his way to the home of Henry Osceola, a Seminole Indian who lived in the Everglades swamp. Flynn suffered from permanent damage to his right eye. Later, Flynn and 2 others found a burned circle some 72 feet across under where the object had been hovering. Source: UFO Casebook, Jerome Clark, Brent Rains. There's one thing that stood out to me in this story, that being that the witness could see how this aircraft was made. Most of the time, I feel like UFOs are described as being very perfect looking with no start or end of the ship, no welding marks or rivets like the witness described seeing, so that just stood out to me as something unique to this case. I also find it fascinating at how close he was able to get to the UFO. I fully believe he was probably suffering from some sort of radiation sickness, which is why he had damage to his eyes. I think from what we know now, if you ever encounter a UFO at close range, it would be wise not to get too close, as most people come away from these experiences with horrible radiation sickness and lifelong issues. What do you think? This next story takes place in DeLand, Florida, April 29, 1989, 11:30 p.m. From James S. Greenan. 10-year-old Roger S. woke up and saw 4 entities about 5 foot 6 inches tall standing by the bed. They put Roger on a table-like device that had no legs or supports. The table was white, glass-like, and about 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. The entities put Roger on the table and then floated him over to the bedroom window. They opened the window and floated the bed along the side of the apartment to a small open field. They then approached a craft that was shaped like 2 plates, one inverted over the other. A door opened up on the side of the craft. His next memory was of standing next to a black glass table with buttons on it. The entities had heart-shaped heads with 2 giant black eyes, 2 holes for a nose, a slit for a mouth, and were gold in color. They spoke to the witness, apparently through telepathy. One of the entities pushed a button on the table and the floor lit up. There was a large screen in the room with a panel under it. On the panel, there were numerous buttons. One of the entities pushed a button and the craft went straight up off the ground into the atmosphere. This he saw on the screen. The entities asked Roger what he was, and he replied that he was a human boy. They then took him into another room and showed him a film of his friend Nancy in a hospital. He asked where Nancy was, and they told him that she was on another ship and she will not be reborn because she had been born too many times. He was also shown images of past events and given information on future events. A small floating device approached the witness and apparently took a small skin sample from a sore on one of his fingers. He was then taken to another table where a man was sitting up. He was about 30 years old with blonde hair and a mustache. He was then directed to another panel where they told him to push the buttons. Soon, the smaller object apparently entered a larger craft. It was white inside the larger ship. They removed his night clothes and gave him a red suit that clung to him. The suit had some writing on it resembling hieroglyphics. He was then taken into another room and was told by the entities that they could make themselves any shape they wanted. They also showed him a map on the wall that was apparently of America. Soon he was told that he was going to be returned. They left and went into another room that was square and had buttons located in the walls. This room also had a screen on which they showed Roger in bed at home, as his father came into the room to check on him. He was then taken into another room that was described as round or circular in shape. In the middle of the room, there was an object that looked like a large clear glass box with 2 buttons on the side. The entities opened a door on the box and had Roger step into it. Then they closed the door behind him. The entities went to a computer-like device and started pushing buttons. At that time, a flat, square, red laser-type light went down over his head to his shoulders and back up again. He was told that they were taking a brain scan. Soon, he went into another room that was all black. Apparently, in this room, they projected a 3D image of Roger skiing down a slope when he was older. After other previews of future events, Roger was taken into a round room. In this room, there were some entities that were different. They looked like the others, but their skin appeared orange. Their eyes were blurry black, and they had only 3 fingers. He asked about them and was told that these were women. Also in this room, there was a very large entity that Roger said he only came up to the middle of his thighs. He looked like the others, except he was wearing a robe with writing on it. Another entity with blue tight-fitting clothing that was about Roger's height and very muscular was also present. There was another alien somewhat smaller than the larger one and wearing a black cape and a helmet. All 3 left the room while Roger was still there. After some questioning about reproduction, he was taken into another very large room. This room had a lot of glass cages with different animals in them. Some of the animals were normal Earth animals, but others were bizarre mixtures of different animals. Soon, Roger was taken into the smaller craft, which then left the larger craft and flew back to Earth. The aliens took him back into his house through the front door and led him into his room. All during the encounter, Roger was followed by a small red sphere or probe. In one of the rooms, he was shown a screen in which he saw humans wearing uniforms with NASA emblems that were apparently experimenting on some aliens lying on cots or beds. Now, this experience has a couple of things that stood out to me. The biggest thing that stood out to me was how many rooms the witness was taken to. I have never heard of this in any other abduction story before. Have you? I don't find it too odd that Roger was shown past and future events. I feel like this isn't uncommon when it comes to abduction stories. I do wish we could have known more about his friend Nancy and why she was different and apparently abducted and not going to return home like Roger would. I wonder if the brain scan had anything to do with that. It also appears that Roger was possibly astral projected into the spaceship instead of his physical body being moved, which is very odd to me. Have you ever heard of this happening with other abduction cases? This next story comes from Davie, Florida, December 6th, 1976, 5:30 a.m. Source: Newfork. The main witness and his wife were heading west on Sterling Road to drop off his children at a local daycare center. As he was passing a bicyclist, he noticed in the northwest sky a fireball falling. After a minute, he pulled his car over and shut it off to say prayers as he thought it was an airplane crashing. He sat for several minutes after the fireball disappeared behind the trees several miles away, but he saw no flash, nor did he hear an explosion. Within 2 more minutes, the witness and his wife observed a huge, dull, grayish metallic-looking object that was heading slowly towards them and southeast. The object was immense, did not emit any noise, smoke, or any exhaust that would be noticeable from thermal fluctuations of the air around it. The object now appeared to be oblong or cigar-shaped, more than 250 feet long and more than 30 feet high. There seemed to be some sort of whitish light atop it and a light at each end, front and rear but not white. As it approached their vehicle, his wife's upper body leaned out the window to look up at it. He observed it from the windshield inside. As they kept asking what it was, he noticed that the entire interior of the car was illuminated. He then noticed his 4-year-old daughter leaning on the back window looking up. He then looked at his interior light and saw that it was not lit. He immediately looked outside his side window and it was still pitch black outside the car. Then he looked up as best as he could to get a fix on the structure, as it was now less than 50 feet from them. The surface was not metal at all. It had a sandy texture similar to that of shark skin. He could not locate any seams or a single area that would suggest any conventional assembly that he had ever seen. The object became stationary for an undetermined period of time, and they just stared at it for minutes. And then, from the corner of his left eye, the main witness saw a small, childlike figure run rapidly across the front of his headlights. It was about to climb over the metal road barrier, but hesitated and turned toward him. He immediately tried to get a glimpse of any articles that he might be able to identify, but it had nothing. It had no shoes, belt, tools, weapons, or any other devices. His first thought was to jump out and grab it and throw it in the truck. But then a voice of sorts told him not to move or he would be harmed. He tried to lift his arm and was horrified that it looked like it was cut off where the light ended inside the car. He looked at the small figure again and thought that it was so small and having no weapons that he could easily overpower it. The voice again warned him that the stretch cloth suit that the figure was wearing carried 40,000 volts of piezoelectrical current. The figure then hopped over the fence and went into a horse breeding ranch at about 140th Street. His last memory of the incident was when he was looking behind his car and seeing a somewhat different shaped object about 1 mile south of his location moving slowly at first. But then as he watched, the object seemed to accelerate so fast that it just vaporized. He then drove off without speaking a word to his wife, and at the daycare center realized that they had been at the site for over 40 minutes. He also lost his full eyesight for almost 2 days after the incident. This is an interesting sighting story. I have to wonder if the object they saw crashing down to Earth was actually a downed UFO, and perhaps the second flying object they saw was the rescue ship. I can't say for sure, obviously, but that's just where my mind went. I also have to wonder then if the strange small being they saw was maybe a survivor of that crash trying to get to the rescue ship. I'm not sure if this being was speaking directly to the witness, or maybe whoever was piloting the rescue ship was speaking to him. I have to wonder if the wife or child was spoken to in the same manner or not. I do think the witness could have been suffering the effects of radiation sickness, and that is why he lost his eyesight for a few days. I also have to wonder if his wife had any sickness as well, as she also stuck her body out of the car to get a better look at what they were seeing. This next story comes from Tampa, Florida, December 19th, 2000, 9 p.m., from UFOs and Aliens Among Us and direct information from the witness. Autumn Dreesen had gone out to empty the trash, and as she walked back from the curb, she heard a noise above her. It was a very high-pitched whistle she could barely hear. Her dog, which had accompanied her, turned his head from side to side. The noise grew louder and she looked up. She saw a bright circular light floating near the moon. Her dog ran back into the house. The noise suddenly stopped, and then 5 very strange humanoids appeared in a circle around her. They were about 4.5 feet tall, pure white in color, had no hair, and had very large red oval-shaped eyes, no mouth, and 2 slits for noses, and no ears that she could see. Their heads were egg-shaped. She stood frozen with fear. 2 of them grabbed her arms, and 2 of them grabbed her legs. The last one held his left palm up to the sky, and her neighborhood dissolved into an odd round room with a dentist-like chair in the middle of it. Similar beings lined the wall of the room. She was led to the chair and was forced to sit in it with her arms at her sides and her legs together. Suddenly, her arms, chest, forehead, and legs were chained to the chair. The chair tilted back, flat like a table. There was some light in the room, but she could not see the source of it. 5 humanoids then leaned over her. Her clothes were somehow removed by one of the humanoids. He left with her clothes, then came back with a table with multiple syringes. Some were empty, and some were filled with different colored liquids. Then one of the humanoids took a blood sample from her using a syringe. Then, in the exact same spot on her arm, they injected a thick-looking blue liquid. Immediately, her whole body went numb, but she was still awake, but everything was blurry. One of the beings now leaned over her right foot. She then felt a painful jabbing and then something being stuck. She became numb again. He then put his warm, white fingers on her forehead, and she felt calm and relaxed. She then heard a soft, beautiful voice that somehow terrified her. The voice told her to not be afraid, that they hurt most others, but that she was special, that she was essential to their plans. They said the Earth was the most under-evolved planet in the universe, that there was a superior race in the galaxy very far away that was planning to take over Earth, turning humanity into slaves. This was going to happen soon, and that they could only take one member of her family, and that she had been chosen. She was then told that she must go. The room then dissolved into the curb, with her standing there holding a trash bag. She had been gone for 3 hours. She found her dog back on her bed trembling with fear. The next day, she found a strange wound on her foot. This case is interesting in that it didn't seem to be a long encounter from what I can tell, but she was in fact gone, either physically, mentally, or both, for 3 hours. Had the witness just been standing outside for 3 hours, appearing to be zoned out? It would seem odd to me if she was, because you would assume, if she lived in a suburban location, someone would have noticed her and called for help, or even checked on her themselves. What I find compelling for this case is that her dog was with her and obviously had a reaction to these beings. To me, this lends credibility to her story that obviously something had to have happened for another living being to react as well. I have to wonder if this wasn't the witness's first time being taken by these beings either. What are your thoughts on this case? This next story comes from Blount Island, Jacksonville, Florida, January 26, 1972, 3 a.m. Source being Lloyd Brown for the Jacksonville Journal. While an electrician by profession, Norman Chastain is an outdoorsman by hobby, so on a Friday evening in late January 1972, the 60-year-old man drove with his cabin boat and trailer toward Blount Island, which lies inland from the Atlantic Ocean near the mouth of the St. Johns River, which is east of Jacksonville. The island is essentially an industrial complex with municipal docks, a generating plant, and towering power lines. It was soon to figure prominently in the news as the Audubon Society fought in the courts to prevent a platform-mounted, floating nuclear power plant from being constructed on the island. But for Norman Chastain, Blount Island meant calm water and a likely spot to catch large red bass. He anchored the sea camper 50 feet from the shore. It was high slack tide. Across the island, the deserted passenger liner, the Constitution, rested at storage anchor. The midwinter night was so quiet, Chastain could hear a tiny frog croaking across the river. He began fishing, and the hours passed quickly. It was nearly 3 a.m. when he first noticed the orange and blue lights flashing over the Fort Caroline National Monument. Must be mosquito control, Chastain thought to himself. But he soon changed his mind. The lights remained stationary, hovering around about 300 feet over the monument and changing colors frequently. Could be a police helicopter, he wondered. No, there wasn't a sound. Suddenly, the lights moved directly toward him, stopping 150 feet over his boat. The domed, circular shape was clear now, and the electrician knew he was looking at a craft that was not from this planet. Approximately 75 feet across, 8 feet thick, with a dome estimated at 5 feet high, the strange object had brilliant lights around its circumference. When I saw it was a UFO, and the first one I'd ever seen in my life, naturally, I was kind of startled, Chastain said. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what it might do. After the initial shock wore off, Chastain reasoned that the craft might have mistaken his boat's running lights for another alien object. The sea camper had some unusual lighting features which Chastain built himself, blinking red and green marker lights, a flashing white light on the bow, and several reflectors. The 2-burner Coleman lantern mounted on top of the cabin was also burning. For 5 minutes the craft hovered noiselessly overhead until Chastain snapped off the main light switch and turned out the lantern. Almost instantly, the UFO lights went out, and he watched the dark outline of the object move slowly back toward the bluff from where it had come. Chastain believed his strange encounter was over and that he had seen the last of the alien spaceship. Now he had other things to worry about, because in the excitement of the sighting, the tide had shifted and pushed his boat aground. He made his way onto the dark island to hunt for a piece of driftwood to pry his boat off the shore and back into deeper water. He carried a strong spotlight with him and played the light over the ground to avoid stepping in any holes. Some distance from the boat, he located a 10-foot plank and began making his way back to the sea camper. I stopped about 75 feet from my boat to rest a minute, as that wet piece of timber was heavy, Chastain said. I raised my spotlight to see if my boat was still in the muck, and there, in the edges of the bushes, was the strangest-looking creature one could ever imagine. Standing in the waist-high growth was an alien being, clothed in a tight-fitting suit that the witness compared to old-fashioned men's winter underwear, except it was a dark silver gray and it shined slightly. The being was about 5 to 5.5 feet tall, with small arms, a large head with pointed ears, and a slightly angular chin. On the top of its head was a glowing disc. The creature's mouth was slightly open and framed in the bright glow from Chastain's spotlight. The oversized, protruding eyes resembled glass reflecting light. As the witness understated, it didn't look human at all. For several frozen moments, alien and Earthman gazed at each other. Then suddenly, the being raised his left hand, which held a flat device about 3 inches across. There was a brilliant white flash, which Chastain said almost blinded him. Then the numbness started, a slow paralysis that began in his neck and moved throughout his body. I staggered around so dizzy I couldn't stand up, so I lay down in the tall grass. My arms and legs became numb and tingled, just like when your leg goes to sleep. I was tempted to scream for help, hoping somebody might be on the island and would come to my rescue. But then I decided it might be better just to lie still. The devil-looking thing might have come up to where I was and finished me off in an instant. After the brilliant ray from the alien's weapon flashed in his face, an overpowering stench seemed to cling to Chastain's hair and clothes, a sickening, unfamiliar odor which he said didn't compare to a skunk. Whether his foul smell was part of the beam or one of its after effects, Chastain couldn't be sure. Now laying paralyzed in the grass, the terrified witness said, "For the first hour I was sure I would die, but I prayed and prayed. The numbness began going away. About daybreak, I was able to get up on my hands and knees and crawl further away from the boat. By noon of the next day, my strength returned and I could walk again. It was a warm day. I could see my boat about 50 feet out in the water with the door open and no one inside. The offensive odor still covered him. Chastain swam out to his boat, put on swimming trunks, and dried his clothes, but the stench still remained. He washed his hair with a disinfectant, threw the clothes in a roadside ditch on the way home, and felt almost normal, except for having a peculiar, light feeling, almost as if he was floating on air. This condition didn't escape his wife's notice. "You don't look right, Norman," she said as soon as he walked in the house. "What's the matter?" Since Mrs. Chastain had been under a doctor's care, he didn't want to upset her with the details of his frightening experience. So I told her a little lie, that the water had been rough and I got seasick, the witness said. What's more, I didn't tell anyone else for fear of being ridiculed or having somebody accuse me of being some kind of nut. Norman Chastain couldn't have known that his experience with the humanoid from another world was far from over. The following day, he went to his physician for a checkup, just in case the alien ray might have done some permanent damage, or by chance the paralysis might have been caused by a stroke or heart attack. His doctor gave him a clean bill of health. The electrician returned to the island in the daytime to search for some clues or evidence of his bizarre encounter, but there wasn't a trace. He smelled around the grass and bushes where he had fallen, but the noxious odor was gone. The piece of timber was still on the ground where he had dropped it. He went back to work at the railroad as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But his nights weren't ordinary, for Chastain began to experience vivid dreams of another planet with strange-looking beings, remarkably huge flowers, and assembly lines which put out saucer-shaped craft. He kept these dreams, as well as the incident on Blount Island, to himself. Not being well informed about UFOs, Chastain wasn't aware of the many strange objects sighted over power lines, generating plants, and atomic installations. Nor had he ever researched the many cases concerning humanoids, so he couldn't have known the alien he saw was not unique in appearance or actions. Silver gray, tight-fitting uniforms, prominent glowing eyes, pointed ears, mysterious rays which blind or paralyze. All these are familiar features in documented sightings reported by responsible eyewitnesses to UFO investigators all over the world. It was now just a few days into February 1972, and Norman Chastain was asleep when a loud clap of thunder woke him up. It was lightning and raining, and then that same overpowering, distinctive stench that thing shot at me was pouring into my bedroom window. I jumped up to close the window, got my gun, and stayed awake the rest of the night, listening and smelling that sickening odor. I wonder if that creature had some way of knowing where I went when I left the island. Chastain got up several times during the stormy night to peer nervously out the window. His wife was sleeping in a separate bedroom on the opposite side of the house. Finally, the storm ended and it was morning. Chastain heard his wife moving about and the cat meowing to be let out. He dressed rapidly and with gun in hand, cautiously opened the back door from where the stench was pouring in. For a moment, he thought he'd lost his mind. Growing in the grass directly behind the sea camper was a cluster of flesh-colored heads. It was like a scene out of an all-too-real horror movie, but the plants all resembled the facial distortions of the alien on the island and were producing the same terrible odor. With mouths gaping, large eye sockets shining with a white substance like glazed eyes, there of the 5-inch tall heads appeared fully developed, while 2 of the smaller ones, according to Chastain, like newborn babes with their eyes closed. The witness shuddered, looking skyward and on the ground for a spacecraft or other growths, but there was nothing else unusual to be seen. He had to have someone else witness the strange growth, so he rushed to some of his neighbors' homes. The men had already gone to work. In a state of near frenzy, Chastain returned home, grabbed a shovel, and dug up 2 of the bigger heads and the 2 smaller ones and tossed them behind the nearby utility shed. Then he called to his wife, asking her to join him in the backyard. Her first shocked response was, "Lord, that looks like something from another world." Chastain desperately wanted to tell his wife everything that had happened the night he went fishing alone on Blount Island, but he held back, concerned about her delicate health. Already she was showing signs of becoming ill from smelling the noxious odor of the remaining growth. "Go inside and call the police. Tell them something strange is growing in our backyard," Chastain said to his wife, "and have them say I'm drunk or crazy when I tell them what it looks like, a pink devil with big eyes and pointed ears and a round mouth that's stinking up the neighborhood," was her response. Chastain had to agree with her, but he desperately wanted other witnesses. Grabbing a shovel, he dug up the last freak growth, jumped in his car, and headed for the Jacksonville Journal newspaper offices. He carefully placed the head on the front floorboard of his car. "I had to drive with my head out the window because the stench was overpowering me," he said. "I was getting dizzy, the same helpless feeling I experienced on the island, and I was scared the numbness might start to set in before I reached the newspaper office." En route, Chastain narrowly avoided hitting another car. He jammed on his brakes, and the growth slammed against the steep portion of the floorboard. Now another nightmare began. The head started oozing a red substance after the impact, a secretion which Chastain described similar to blood. He tried to regain his composure at the newspaper offices as he described the weird plant in his car to the news editor. Chastain made no reference to the craft or alien on Blount Island. According to reports, soil samples were taken from different depths in Chastain's backyard and on Blount Island, and subjected to various tests in several laboratories. The backyard soil, under preliminary microscopic examination, possessed a substantial fungi hyphae, root filaments, and it was hoped that the spores remaining in the samples would germinate in a humidity chamber set to duplicate the condition that prevailed on the night they grew. Now this case is just absolutely bizarre to me. I don't think I've ever heard of some sort of alien plant like this, and especially not in an alien or UFO encounter. I don't find it surprising that the witness saw the UFO where he did, but what I find surprising is how well he was able to recall details of the craft, the alien being, and whatever the being did to him. I do have to wonder if he had any missing time with him basically being incapacitated and what seems to be blacking out. I have to wonder if this being was maybe scoping out this area as it was in talks about the nuclear plant, but didn't know someone else would be out there. I mean, I really don't have a good explanation on this. And then the fact that maybe this creature followed the man home and planted this strange plant, if that's what it was. I also have to wonder if the spores were already on the witness when he returned home, and they just happened to take root outside because of that, and maybe the alien didn't follow him home at all. This is all so bizarre and a unique case, regarding the plant anyway. I think the being he saw is pretty run-of-the-mill in terms of alien beings people sometimes report seeing, but the plant really sends the story over the top. I wonder if anything conclusive was ever discovered about this plant, or if the public never found out. What do you think about this bizarre story? This next story takes place in Medulla Township, Florida, October 18, 1968, 7:30 p.m. The source, Lee Butcher, Fate Magazine, May 1969. Mr. and Mrs. Buck McMullen had just sat down to eat when their dog, chained outside their modest house south of Lakeland, began to whimper and howl. They paid little attention to him, although the dog had a reputation for being vicious and usually showed no fear of anything. That night, however, the animal was obviously terrified, for he tore loose from his chain, ripped a hole in the porch screen, and ran into the dining room to cower under the table where they were sitting. 50 yards from the house, she saw a transparent spherical object rocking gently about 10 feet off the ground. It gave off a purplish red light. Inside the object, Mrs. McMullen says she saw 2 occupants, resembling normal men. They were standing, operating a horizontal bar attached to a metallic spindle that ran through the object from the top to bottom. They wore dull white, tight-fitting clothing, boots, high collars, and skull caps. Stunned, Mrs. McMullen turned on the porch light to attract their attention, but they didn't appear to be interested. Although she admits she was frightened, Mrs. McMullen says that she realized that it could be important and tried to remember everything that occurred. Her husband and her son's fiancée, Sharon Burgess, who was visiting, came outside and stood dumbfounded, but Mrs. McMullen did verify that they were all seeing the same thing. She had thought that she might be dreaming. According to the McMullen's description, the occupants inside the sphere were operating a horizontal bar with their hands inside some sort of flexible compartment. They stood on opposite sides of the spindle, and when one pushed down on his side of the bar, the ship rocked to that side. As they worked the horizontal bar, the ship rocked, and as the rocking increased, the ship increased its altitude and speed. Mrs. McMullen thinks it might have been on the ground in a vacant field just in front of their house and was taking off when she got outside. She was able to determine the UFO's size and altitude by its relationship to a tall palm tree beside the home. Sharon hung back on the porch, and suddenly the dog tore another hole in the screen, getting out of the house, and it ran down the road howling in terror. The object rose slowly, rocking until it was about a mile from the house. Then there was a silent burst of fire and sparks, and it sped out of sight. Mrs. McMullen says the UFO was in sight for about 10 minutes. Mrs. McMullen reports that the object appeared to be made of a substance resembling glass. It made no sound, and she saw no source of power aboard. A band of blue light circled its middle, and a halo of purplish red light shone around the top. These lights glowed dully, and both beams were aimed upward. The occupants were turned away from her so she could not see their faces. The object was about 30 feet in diameter, a perfectly circular globe, and there appeared to be no place inside for occupants to sit. What I like about this sighting is that there were multiple witnesses, which I feel is important when it comes to UFO sightings. This is definitely an odd sighting, as I have never heard of this type of UFO before, especially with the way it seems this one was piloted with some sort of bar device. I have never heard of this before, so to me this lends this story some credibility. I do have to wonder what these beings were doing in this location. Could it possibly be they didn't mean to land and were trying to get back to wherever they were going? Maybe broken down? Perhaps they were having some technical difficulties and were just trying to fix things up before taking off again. I also want to add that I think this story has even more credibility because of the fact that their dog was acting very out of character. For some reason, this helps me believe more when animals act strange with encounter stories. Do you feel the same way? This story takes place at an undisclosed location on the east coast of Central Florida. Spring 2007, nighttime. From R Paranormal on Reddit. At a rest stop area off the highway, the witness saw a vaguely human-looking being that was between 10 and 14 feet tall. It was sitting down. Its face was very snake-like. It looked like a cross between a demon and an alien. It had chalk white skin. It had eyes several times larger than human eyes. Its eyes had no sclera, no whites. Its nose was little more than 2 small air holes, and its mouth was very thin. It seemed gaunt, but its entire body was covered by an enormous, black, hooded robe that it wore. It stared at the witness very intensely. Immediately, it communicated with the witness, who was flooded with what he considered to be telepathic messages from the being. I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. I must travel by night and exist in darkness. I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. I cannot be seen. And he felt an enormous wave of compassion for the being rather than fear, which may have seemed a more logical reaction to someone hearing this story. For some reason, his brain only categorized it as one thing initially, an outsider worthy of compassion and tolerance. It looked quite gaunt under its enormous robe, pretty frail looking. It was sitting on its bottom, knees bent, back against the brick front of a rest area, to the left of the front doors of the rest area. It was sitting with its back very straight, tall and erect. It seemed in awe of the witness, and maybe in awe that the witness was actually approaching it. It looked vaguely like a human, very vaguely. Its face was snake-like. Its eyes were right on the witness. The witness threw a little everyday smile in its direction, and then he did something strange. He continued to walk toward the rest area even after seeing the creature to get closer to it. He walked forward about 20 feet from the rear of the van to the rest area steps, up the 20 or so steps, and to the right, where the vending machine was located. His thoughts at this point were very bizarre in retrospect. He felt bad for the thing. He didn't want it to feel different. He didn't want to run back into the van because he didn't want to hurt its feelings. So it was with a very bizarrely strong conviction to be righteous and humane to it that he walked toward the vending machine. He actually got a bag of pretzels from the machine, his stomach churning. He used the vending machine with his back to it. Pretzels in hand, he swiveled around to look at it again before descending back down the steps. It was at that moment that pure terror rippled through him. He was closer to it now, approximately 15 feet away, and he could now see that there was definitely no way that it was a human. It was staring right at him like a wide-eyed insect. It was still exactly in the same position, except for that it had turned its head to look at him better as his position changed. He could now tell that the eyes were almost almond-shaped. He then realized that it was unthinkably tall. Although he was standing and it was sitting, its head still stood taller than him. Its huge eyes were fixed on him with fascination, alarm, and with the most intense focus. just like the way a cat looks at something right before it pounces on it. When he made the decision to climb the stairs toward it and not to retreat to the van, he thought it was sitting on top of something, and that was why its head was raised up so high. So after the ripple of terror went through him, he responded by smiling the way you smile at a stranger when your eyes catch on the bus. He had never acted so cool in his life. The witness then returned to his van and left the rest stop. This is an incredibly strange story, and I have never read a story like this before. I'm not sure if I would immediately think this creature was an alien, but obviously I don't know. I have to wonder if whatever this strange being was something normally humans couldn't see, and maybe that's why it seemed so surprised that the witness definitely saw it. It almost seemed frightened that the witness could see him. On one hand, I feel bad for this creature. It seemed almost lost or something. I can understand, sort of, why the witness just wanted to seem friendly to it. Maybe the creature itself was lost or something. On the other hand, I do have to wonder if the creature was using this meekness to lure someone in to attack. The way the witness described how it almost seemed cat-like in the way a cat acts before it attacks its prey. So I'm undecided if this thing was good or bad. Maybe it was neither. I'm not really sure. What do you think? This next story takes place between Port Charlotte and Englewood, Florida, June 11, 2011, during the nighttime. From MUFON CMS. The main witness was fishing in a popular local fishing spot on a pier that was directly underneath a bridge. He was with a couple of people that night and decided to move away from them and go to the very end of the pier, which turned out to be right toward the water so he could catch some fish. According to the witness, there was only 5 people on the pier that night, and where he was located was pretty far from his 2 friends. Also, the pier is extremely long, and it was very dark, so they couldn't see each other at all. He cast his rod out in the water and noticed the water straight ahead of him start to move, but not creating any waves or bubbles. He could only describe it like if you threw a stone in water and the rings created by the stone. At this point, he could see a lot of things suddenly start to appear before his eyes. On this particular night, the moon was extremely bright and made the water glow as well, and made the water directly in front of the witness very clear, so he was able to see clearly on this night. As the things on top of the water start to appear, a triangular-shaped object emerged completely out of the water. It hovered directly over the water and moved in an upward direction directly above where it had emerged from. The witness guesses that it was hovering about 7 to 10 feet above the water, and he could see a spotlight type of beam moving around as if scanning or searching for something. This beam of light continued to do this for a very long time, perhaps 15 minutes. The shocked witness watched in awe as the UFO was suddenly gone in a split second. It just seemed to vanish. As he stood there in complete disbelief, he suddenly heard a high-pitched sound and his head started to hurt. The pain in his head was the worst pain he had ever felt in his life. It literally felt as if his brain was going to explode. He was pretty confused and was left standing there trying not to cry because whatever was happening to his head and brain was incredibly difficult to deal with. While holding his head in his hands, he happened to look up above him, not really sure why he did this, and saw the massive UFO, which was at least 3 stories high and with a huge transparent dome over it, hovering above him. He claims he was able to see inside the UFO and saw computers and lights all over the place. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, and all along the dome there were windows and behind them stood what he described as little children. He could see everything and everyone clearly inside the UFO. As he looked at the children, they seemed to be about the same age group, and their faces all looked the same also. Their clothing was of a dull color, and it seemed to him that their eyes were black in color. Next, the terrified witness saw inside the UFO what he described as giants. They looked human except for their height, which according to the witness was at least 15 feet tall. These giants were doing something in the back where all the electronic devices were at. At this point, the witness started feeling apprehensive and felt like he was in danger. Fear and panic took over him, and he began praying out loud. As he did this, he could see the giants walking back and forth as if they were nervous about something. And then, according to the witness, they looked at him with a strange look on their faces, as if they were afraid and angry at the same time. The witness kept praying, asking God to protect him from these evil creatures, as he felt they were, when suddenly there was a loud bang and the UFO was gone. Terrified, he went back to his two friends and attempted to tell them what he had seen, but it was difficult for them to believe him, and they thought he was just trying to joke around. So with this story, I find it interesting that it appears that only the witness saw this whole thing happening. I can't imagine the pier they were on was so incredibly long that the other people were completely out of view, so that is very odd to me. The noise the witness heard and the pain in his head doesn't really surprise me, as it seems that often UFO sightings are accompanied by some strange humming, droning, or buzzing noise that sometimes also hurts witnesses. I find it fascinating that the witness was able to see inside the craft as well as they could. If this UFO was as large as they said it was, there's no way the others on the pier wouldn't have been able to see it too. Which leads me then to wonder if maybe there was some sort of cloaking device around the object that was keeping humans from seeing it, and that for whatever reason the witness was just able to see it, or that he was somehow inside the cloaking field accidentally, which might explain why the giant beings seemed annoyed and surprised by him because of this fluke. It's really very strange all around. What are your thoughts on this encounter? Our next story takes place in Naples, Florida, June 17, 2011, 10 p.m. From New Fork. The witness had gone to sleep around 10 p.m. in a room with another person sleeping in the bed next to his, similar to sharing a hotel room. When he went to sleep, everything seemed normal. He regained consciousness in what seemed like a hospital room. The first thing he noticed was that he was lying flat on his back on what appeared to be a hospital bed. He immediately assumed he was in a hospital, but then he realized that there was no way possible that he could be in a hospital, so he began to look around. He noticed the walls of the room seemed to be a metallic color. This freaked him out because he knew hospital rooms have bright colors and do not have metal walls. At this point, he went into a defense mode. He began trying to understand his surrounding environment, and the more details he noticed, the more confused and scared he became. He made a quick glance to his right and saw two people, and near her feet another two. Then to his left, he noticed a person sitting in a chair perpendicular to his hospital bed. His attention was struck by the person on his left in the chair. At this time, he realized that he was unable to move, almost like being asleep but awake at the same time. He had mental awareness and could see everything around him. The person to his left was a female human. This he is sure about. He was so frightened that he remembers the woman telling him it was okay, and that it would be all over soon. The witness then watches as the woman sticks a needle into his left arm, similar to how an IV needle is placed, but different. Their technique of placing the needle required no tape or gauze to hold it in place, which he had never seen, and he had been in the hospital before. The needle itself was metal, but its luster was odd. He couldn't remember if it was too dull or too shiny. It was nothing he had seen before, possibly an unknown metal. When he heard the woman telling him that there was nothing to be worried about, he went from defense mode to panic mode. The last thing he remembers seeing at that point was the person in front of him, one of the people at his feet. They had what seemed to be a wire connecting to an LED flashlight. It was all white, and he could see the LED bulbs in the flashlight. He was explained through a mental communication that this was a way to decipher or something. He thinks it was to know who he was or to locate him. It was done for a reason, but he just can't remember exactly why. The flashlight implement was designed so the placement of each bulb could be measured through its complex variations and measurements so that it could be calculated to individually differentiate people. In essence, to separate them or track them. They literally touched the lights to his right foot. He didn't feel pain or anything. He blacked out after that. Later, he woke up in the same room. He had no idea how much time passed by. No one else was in the metal room. He was alone. Near where his feet were, there was a door, the same color as the walls. Apparently, he was now able to move, and he walked out that door. He entered a diagonal hallway. On one side, opposite the door, it was solid metal flat wall, maybe 100 feet long from what he could see. He went 10 feet to the right and then saw a door and opened it. It was the same looking room he was just in. He closed the door and started walking down the hallway in the opposite direction. He passed maybe 10 rooms identical to the one he just came out of. When he gets to what seems to be a pivot point in the ship, he imagined the ship he was in as V-shaped. There was a giant window, maybe 30 feet tall and 75 feet wide. When he looked out the window, he saw Earth. It was glorious to view. It made him realize that he was not on his own planet. Needless to say, he panicked, and then he saw beings walk by him who were not human. The one he focused on had an olive-colored skin, looked very wet but dry, maybe like a lizard or a snake. The facial features looked like a mixture of Hispanic, African, and Asian combined. The strangest thing about them was that they had what resembled fish gills on the side of their face, where the human cheeks are located. Almost like slicing a person's cheek to look like gills or flaps. The figures must have been 6.5 to 7 feet tall. He asked the being if this was real, and it grabbed his hand. The next thing he knew, he regained consciousness inside his own bathroom. He was staring at the mirror in his bathroom. When he snapped back into reality, he realized that he was in shock. He looked where the needle was inserted into his arm, and there was a blood spot or a scab. He was feeling very groggy, and had the strange feeling that he had been in an ocean the whole day or skiing on a mountain all day. At this point, he also realized it was 6:45 or 7 a.m. Almost 9 hours had passed. He felt like he hadn't slept the entire night. A week later, a spot identical to the shape of the LED lights placed on his foot appeared. According to the witness, he still has this strange mark. If it wasn't for the physical marks on the witness's body, I would almost assume this was a hypnagogic hallucination. But because there was physical evidence, I'm not sure what to think. I find it very strange that in some abduction cases, that at first the abductee cannot move and is stuck where they are, only then to later be able to freely move about the UFO they're in. I don't know if this is on purpose, or maybe whoever was supposed to be watching the abductee took a quick snack break when they shouldn't have. I really don't know. I also swear I've read a case very similar to this one before, so please let me know if I have. This last story takes place in West Palm Beach, Florida, June 2005, during the nighttime. From thebookofthought.com. The 17-year-old witness and his mother were visiting the witness's grandparents at night, and as he was getting ready to go to bed, he apparently fell asleep with the television on. But in between the period of half sleep and half awake, he felt himself falling, as if he was sinking into the bed. But not his physical body, his spiritual body, he supposes. All of a sudden, everything was extremely clear in full color, and he found himself in some type of hospital or laboratory place. At this time, he became aware that he was lucid dreaming or astral traveling. Curious, he explored the location and went down the halls, and as he was looking, he came across a large hutch or shelf. There were a lot of scientific instruments and folders everywhere. He then looked up and saw a row of jars. Upon closer inspection, he realized there was some type of fetus in each jar. It seemed to be dead, floating in a liquid, and on the jar were numbers which he can't remember. He kept on inspecting everything, but never touching anything when he heard something next to him, a grunting sound. As he turned, standing in front of him was a creature about 4 feet tall. The next thing he noticed was its eyes and mouth. The eyes were yellow, large, and round, with black slits for its pupils. The mouth looked almost stretched, like a Cheshire cat's grin with small, sharp teeth. It had small, V-shaped nostrils, and it appeared to be very mischievous. Its skin was scaly like a dinosaur, and it did have a tail that curled in the back. It was dark green in color, with a lighter underside. The witness was actually more curious than frightened because the creature looked so weird to him. Then another came and stood beside it. At this point, the witness became fearful and thought he had to get out of there, or the creatures would attack him. He started to run through the halls, or rather soar through them, because he wanted to wake up. The 2 reptilian creatures chased after him when he suddenly felt himself being sucked back into his body. He then woke up in bed. He was awake, but he couldn't move. His heart was pounding so fast he thought he was going to die. He tried to relax and move, but his muscles simply wouldn't budge. The only thing he could move was his eyes. Incredibly, at this point, the witness realized that the 2 reptilian creatures had somehow followed him back to his bedroom. The witness saw them standing in the room and immediately thought he was having a nightmare. He stayed in bed not knowing what to do. He then saw one of the creatures walk over to his mother's bed, she was staying in the same room, and leap onto the bed and start to sniff her, but it was also trying to scratch her, but for some reason it couldn't. There seemed to be a barrier around his mother. He then felt a big thump on his bed and turned his gaze to a pair of horrible evil eyes that the creature had. The second creature had jumped onto the witness's bed and was now only 3 inches from his face. So close that he could see a small orange golden iris around its pupils. The most incredible sense of dread fell over him, and he honestly thought that the creature was going to kill him. He screamed and yelled, but nothing came out. The creature seemed to be hyper and kept on thrashing all over the witness, bouncing around and causing the bed to shake. He heard hissing and growling and noticed an odor like sewage and sulfur. The stench was overwhelming, and so was the fear. The reptilian creature was trying to get the witness. It was clawing and trying very hard to hurt the witness, but somehow it couldn't. It finally gave up after several minutes. Then the other creature that was on his mother's bed hopped off and came over to his side. It signaled to the one on top of the witness, and the creature jumped off. At this point, he was suddenly able to move. He sat up and took a deep breath, and sat shocked as he watched both the creatures run over towards the bathroom and disappear right through the wall. He turned the light on and woke up his mother and tried to tell her what had occurred. His mother didn't believe him and dismissed the whole thing as a bad dream. He slept with the covers over his head the rest of the night. So this case is just downright bizarre. My immediate reaction to this is to think that this sounds a lot like sleep paralysis and a hypnagogic hallucination mixed together. If you don't know what a hypnagogic hallucination is, according to the Cleveland Clinic, hypnagogic hallucinations are hallucinations that happen as you're falling asleep. They're common and usually not a cause for concern. Up to 70% of people experience them at least once. A hallucination is a false perception of objects or events involving your senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Hallucinations seem real, but they're not. And this could very well be what was happening to the witness. I myself have had hypnagogic hallucinations before, and they are extremely jarring and disorienting. With that said, I can't say for sure what exactly happened here because this didn't happen to me, and I'm just trying to relate myself to this story. Putting that aside, it does seem like the witness either unintentionally astral projected or maybe something else into this other world that was inhabited by these mischievous little aliens that had bad intentions, or maybe just saw him as prey. I find it interesting that they seem to chase him all the way back to his physical body, but then couldn't actually harm him or his mother. Perhaps with them not being from this reality, they were not able to harm them. I'm not really sure. The one thing I think lends credibility to this story would be that because the thing was trying so hard to harm the witness, it was actually able to shake the bed, which could indicate that this very strange encounter actually was happening. It's all very weird. What are your thoughts on this case? Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you gave this video a like, as it really helps my channel out. As always, don't forget to comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up to date with everything I post. If you have your own story to share, you can comment below, post it on my subreddit, r/ihaveaspookystory, and also send it to my Gmail, PinkPossiblyStories@gmail.com. Maybe your story will be in a future video. I just wanted to quickly say thank you to everyone who comments and interacts with me in the comments. I love getting to see what you have to say and connect with you all. So thank you again. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the shadows bite.